Daniel Levine, and welcome to In Depth. Joining us today is Jim Greenwood, CEO of the Biotechnology Industry Organization. Jim, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So looking back at healthcare reform, it seems to me that while the legislative process created a lot of uncertainty for the industry and contributed to a difficult financing environment, you actually emerged in pretty good shape. Notably, one of the big victories was on biosimilars and getting 12 years of exclusivity. What did that mean for the industry?
Well, if you mean we ended up in good shape, if you mean bio, we did. We never actually outright endorsed the legislation, nor did we outright oppose the legislation. We chose our battles, chose them carefully, and as you mentioned, biosimilars was a huge part of that. Our strategy, going back before this was even a part of healthcare reform, was to be counterintuitive, and that is, instead of taking the position, let's oppose biosimilars because it provides competition, which is what Big Pharma did when it came to generics industry in the 80s, we said, no, let's be for it, and let's get at the table, and let's explain the science, and explain the economics, and actually inform members of Congress. And we did that, and what we explained was that biologics are the cutting edge of new therapies, and that it's a very tricky and risky business. And if we want the patients to benefit from it, you're going to have to make the economics work to attract the investment. And that all came down to data exclusivity. And we said that we thought 14 years was the right number. We were up against those who said 0 and 5 and 7. And we ended up at 12. And that was an enormous success for us. And most importantly, an enormous success for the patients, because the investment, we think, will flow now. So that was critical.
So we've got the 12 years of exclusivity, but now the pathway has to be constructed by the FDA. November, there's 2 days of public hearings come up. What are the big concerns for the biotech industry in how the FDA goes about actually implementing that law?
Well, you're right. The legislation was a difficult battle, but it's the first in many steps, and the next is, of course, all of the regulations and guidances that will come out of the FDA. So we have to remain very vigilant on that. We have to make sure that we think there should be guidances by category. We think that the patent issues have to be consistent with the statute. We thought it was important that the names be very different. The generic industry wanted to be able to use very similar, if not identical, names, and we thought that that's a bad idea, because we don't want patients or prescribing physicians or treating physicians to be confused between the generics and the biosimilars and the innovative drugs. And so there's much of the devil lies in the detail, but we're pretty confident that we'll be successful.
And do you expect the whole issue of interchangeability, that whether a drug is a biosimilar that a physician has to specifically prescribe, or whether it can be filled with either the generic version or the biosimilar?
That was a very important issue for us, because if someone's been taking the innovative drug for a number of years, and along comes a biosimilar, we think since they are not going to be identical, and we learned the hard way that small differences can make differences in immune response, that it needs to be up to the patient and up to the physician to determine whether to take which drug to take. And so we felt that we prevailed in that argument in the legislation, and we're pretty confident that the regulations will reflect that.
So another big victory to emerge from that legislation was the Therapeutic Discovery Tax Credit, which I think a lot of people were surprised by. Didn't know it was coming. $1 billion over 2 years for research. What's the story behind that credit? How did it get in the legislation?
Well, it goes back to right after the presidential election, and we knew there was going to be a stimulus bill, and we actually tried pretty diligently to get something for the small companies in the stimulus bill, because they were feeling the impact of the international credit crunch. We didn't succeed there because it really was not a tax-focused package. It was an appropriating package. But we learned a lesson from that, which was that if we think in terms of a two-step process, qualify the companies based on size, fewer than 250 employees, focus on companies that are involved in novel and important therapeutic discoveries, unmet needs, and particularly around cancer, and have them be qualified by the Treasury Department, and then provide a grant. Well, actually, it's a tax credit, but most of these small companies don't have revenues against which to take that tax credit, so we made it a refundable tax credit. And so far, there's been a huge demand, which reflects the need. We were a bit stealthy about it. We didn't broadcast the work that we were doing in the Senate Finance Committee because, frankly, sometimes you get something going like that and others hear about it and they all say, me too, and then it becomes either the pie gets divided into too many pieces or the pie gets so big that you can't carry it. So we were very fortunate in getting it put in the Senate Finance Committee. And then, a funny thing happened on the way to the process ending, and that was the Scott Brown election in Massachusetts, which means they didn't have the votes to take the bill back to the Senate. So after it went through the House, so the House basically had to just take lock, stock, and barrel what the Senate had done, and there we were.
So you alluded to the fact that there was a very big need. What do we know about its implementation and the response it's actually gotten from companies?
Well, the administration has kept pretty close to the vest the number of applications, but we think it's probably 3,000 to 4,000. $1 billion seems like a lot of money until you divide it that many ways. We're hoping that, frankly, that the grants and tax credits are of significant size per company to make a difference. We don't want to just see it sort of spread so thinly that everybody succeeds a little bit. But we think that won't happen. We think that the NIH, which is going to be making the decisions about the qualitative decisions as opposed to the quantitative decisions, understands that. We think that they'll do a good job. Now, those grants will be distributed towards the end of October, and because we do think that the demand will exceed the supply, we'll be back to the Congress next year asking to extend and or expand the program. And to maximize the likelihood of our success at that, we're going to monitor all of these grants very, very carefully so we can go back to every member of the Congress and every senator and say, okay, here's what it looked like in your district. These companies applied, these were successful, these are the diseases they're working on, these are how many jobs were saved by all of this. So it'll be tough next year because I think you're going to see a very budget hawkish Congress, and it might be difficult. It's one thing to get $1 billion inside of a $1 trillion package. It's another thing to get a whole nother billion or more next year.
So we talked about good surprises. There were more recently, or there have been some not so good surprises. One was the district court that had put an injunction on federal funding for human embryonic stem cell research.
Right.
There's been a stay from the appeals court, but how disruptive is this among companies, among investors, among researchers, and does this raise problems that need addressing through legislative fixes?
Well, it's been disruptive from the beginning. I think the United States lost some of its edge because some very good investigators went off to Europe and Asia and elsewhere because of the limitations inside of the U.S. The reversal by the Obama administration of George Bush would tell you he actually opened it up a little bit to the existing lines, and there's a lot of truth to that, but then he stopped it there. The Obama administration said it's basically much wider opened. Now this judge slammed the door again, and now his injunction's been removed, and so we've sort of been going back and forth, and that doesn't help at all. It makes investors not so sure that they want to put their money there, and when you think about it, regenerative medicine is really the holy grail of the whole biotech industry ultimately.